Today, we're really pleased to be joined by Shawn O'Brien, who is an Associate Vice President at Internet 2, where he helps oversee cloud services and emerging technologies for more than 600 U.S. research and higher education institutions. I've had the pleasure of knowing Shawn for a long time. He has a master's from Gonzaga University in Communication and Leadership Studies. And before that, he was an undergraduate student at the University of Mary Washington, and he's had close ties as an alum over the years. I've certainly appreciated all of his advice and counsel as we've been getting our Center for AI and the Liberal Arts up and running, and his support for that. And I'm particularly pleased that this semester he's going to be serving as UMW's expert in residence, and he'll be coming to campus. We'll be ready to announce that date very soon, but we're excited to have him on campus to help advise us on some research projects and to have him see some student projects and research presentations at the end of the semester. Shawn, thank you for being here. And I wanted to ask, tell us a little bit about what is Internet 2 for those institutions that haven't worked with you, and what is your role there? What kind of work do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. In talking about what I'm going to help out at the University of Mary Washington this year, I was just thinking about that. Like, that's my penance for not going to class as an undergraduate institution, is now I have to come back and teach and help out just to make sure I hit that attendance level in the end. I'm looking forward to spending more time in class, probably in some buildings that didn't exist when I was a student there. So that'll be fun. Yeah, so for some background on Internet 2, Internet 2 is the National Research and Education Network in the United States. So we connect major research universities, national labs, government organizations, non-government organizations, and industry providers to the research and education network, national backbone here in the US. That's really what Internet 2 was started to provide, as the internet was privatized in the late 90s. Moving out of the NSF net. What Internet 2's really grown up into over the last almost 30 years is an organization where research universities in the United States come together to solve problems at scale. That may be building technologies, that may be, and what I primarily focus on our Net Plus team, is actually working with corporate providers and working with technologies that are being built in industry and helping universities acquire and manage and use those technologies at scale. One of the great things about technologies, whether it's cloud, which is what I've primarily focused on over the last 10 years, or AI as an emerging technology, is the fact that higher education will work together, the fact that we're able to work across universities. There's economies of scale that can be achieved in that, not just in pricing, but also thinking about in developing best practices and developing documentation, in sharing code and learning what other institutions are doing. So we both help our member universities and the broader research and education community negotiate contracts, negotiate business deals, but also think about how we scale that sort of unique research and education infrastructure of sharing. And hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit today in the context of AI.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, here's one of our questions, to unpack that a little bit in the context of AI, I guess, is especially generative AI, but I'm sure universities are using, other AI tools, predictive technologies, and those types of things. It's that there's probably more demand for that, right? As kind of part of the story of the university, as part of what the university wants to accommodate, as part of kind of the image of the university. What do you see kind of, even if it's just starting to percolate at the university level? And, there may be some things that are, just barely percolating, right? We just turned the pot on, and other instances where, that people are trying off and running. I would just wonder if you might give some kind of a broad overview.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously AI is the hottest technology. You can't, listen to a technology podcast, if this one included, without being inundated in AI. So there's a big story there. What I would say in other spaces, other things that are emerging that are maybe interesting, that are going to hit sort of, teaching and learning technologies, but elsewhere in the industry, IoT was really hot 5 to 10 years ago. Everyone was talking about, what are we doing with IoT? I think we've hit a sort of a sense of realism there, where now all of a sudden these technologies are becoming pervasive in institutions. When you think about, things from HVAC systems and what you're able to do monitoring, and how you're able to get chipsets that are so small you can get it into things, to how do you use other various emerging technologies, physical or sort of virtual in the cloud, to support teaching and learning. So thinking about how do we use drones in environmental science? Are those drones connected to Wi-Fi? Are those drones connected to 5G? One of the, I think, the most unique presentations that I was listening to recently was about a university, a major university that has a group of connected cows. They're cows with 5G chips in their ear. And the students and the faculty that are supporting the research are able to glean insights from that. Obviously, robotics is coming in a big way to society, but I think it'll present some interesting opportunities at the university level as well. So those are some other things that I think we're seeing as emerging, but particularly how wireless technologies, how 5G, how some of what's been opened up in the CBRS spectrum space, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is actually enabling some of these other technologies to become really pervasive on a university campus.
I love that story, the cows being connected with 5G, a herd net of sorts as you're managing them. Shawn, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sometimes what we see is a disconnect between, especially upper administration and then faculty and other staff. The Chronicles recently put out a survey or results of a survey of faculty talking about their attitudes towards AI, and fairly negative set of concerns. And there was a recent one where they were interviewing and surveying administrators, and it was definitely a more positive spin. I had a colleague who was asking me about this and said, are you surprised that there's this apparent disconnect between them? Let me ask you, what do you see? What's actually shaping the outcome on the ground? Where is that big mismatch coming from? And how do you see this playing out across different institutions?
Yeah, I'll talk about two different disconnects that I see. So one, let me jump into what you just talked about. And it's interesting. Last night, I was reading an article. I forget what publication it was in, but I was reading an article where they were talking about kind of the thought process of why is management imposing AI on their staff? Why does management love AI and is out there telling the people who work for them, you should be using AI? And I am guilty of that. Hopefully some of the people who work for me will listen to this or watch this podcast and be like, oh, he's talking about himself. Great. But, what this article talked about is generative AI specifically, thinking about the chat bots that are out there, drives a lot of efficiency for management work. You think about drafting emails, drafting reports, creating presentations. I mean, what I'm able to do with Notebook LM and Claude to sort of automate my presentation creation workflow is awesome. Data analysis, all the things sort of the management level does, large language models, generative AI specifically, provides an enormous amount of value for. And I think a lot of that value is self-evident. I think a lot of that value is easily discovered once you have access and start using it. But when you get into different kinds of roles, when you get into different kinds of use cases, it may not be as obvious. So I think there is this sense of, hey, there's this top down saying you should be doing this. And I think where I've seen at least most of the successful AI projects, both in Internet 2, the organization I work in, but also nationally going out and speaking with universities, being at conferences, actually being at universities. A lot of the best projects, the best outcomes come from that bottom up. It's someone identifying a use case for them, not their management saying, oh, you should be using this, not the provost, not the president, not the dean. So I think that's one disconnect is you have a set of users. We'll look at administration as a set of AI users in this case, who maybe are performing different tasks. And in those tasks are seeing enormous value that may not translate the same way to other people, whether it's faculty or any other group on a campus. The other thing that I think is really out of sync when you talk about sort of the great excitement of administration around AI is that intent versus funding piece. What I've seen, what I've read, what I've seen in practice, what I've talked to colleagues who are in IT leadership positions at universities is this real desire from presidents, provosts, other leadership to engage with AI, to embrace AI, to have their university using AI. But when push comes to shove, in many cases at many universities, that intent has not been matched with new durable investment. There may be a one-time investment, but I think a lot of what's been asked is, well, go find the money for AI in the couch cushions, which I think for the last maybe 20 years in higher ed, we've been looking in the couch cushions for money. And AI is a little bit different in some cases than previous technology waves. When we think about cloud computing, which is where I've spent most of my career, you look at software as a service, well, that might replace some existing software licensing. You look at infrastructure as a service, okay, I may be able to move some of my servers out of the data center. There's different dynamics there. Am I moving from CapEx funding to OpEx funding? I'm not paying for power when I'm using it on campus, but when I'm using it in AWS or Microsoft Azure, I am. So there's different things there. AI to me in most cases has just been, it needs net new funding. It's not displacing something. So, one of the things that I think that we all have to grapple with is, leadership is saying this is transformational. We should be doing something, but where's the funding coming from? It's become an unfunded mandate. And I think people in higher ed, in my career working in higher ed, unfunded mandates always turn negative, always get a negative aura about them. So, you've seen some progressive institutions work on corporate partnerships, even tap into their endowment to sort of uplift this, which I think is interesting. And I understand where the challenge is coming from, right? Higher ed's under enormous financial pressure. You have the enrollment challenges. You have uncertainty on federal funding. You've had a long history of declining state support. But that gap versus sort of aspiration and investment, I think is one of the biggest structural challenges of where things are out of sync today.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that, because when you're talking, especially at that first point about that disconnect and just the best models are those that are coming from the bottom up, I think everybody can see that. And I think they're probably good examples of it. But what about for a school? If you're talking to an educational leader at a school saying, I want to encourage that, how do I get that to happen? And part of it is the funding, but what else could they do?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is how do you get the tools? How do you get the tools in people's hands? But also how do you empower people? One of the things I have heard in various organizations where I've had conversations with people is, well, I don't know what I'm allowed to do. It's not just, I think maybe the 2023, early 2024 question about that was, well, like, what tool should I use? What tool do I have access to? What do I, how do I go about doing this? I think now it gets into a sense of, well, am I allowed to do that or not? And one of the things I think, we all spent, and I use we because I think it's true probably of every organization, a lot of time thinking about policy, thinking about governance, and there was a lot of time spent on how do we manage risk initially when AI came. And I don't know if there was as much time spent on how do we figure out how to enable people. So there's obvious ones of like, how do you create this ground up culture? Do you help provide seed funding? Obviously, universities have done that. Do you go out and buy access to the most performant AI models? Obviously, universities have done that. I think the one thing that I hear that maybe people aren't thinking about that I would hope people maybe can take away from this podcast or this conversation is actually verbally empowering people and telling them what they can do and telling them that there is an expectation. You're working at a higher ed institution in the United States. That's been a core part of the innovation and growth engine of this country. Like, be innovative, take some risks. Don't put the university's data at risk. Don't go off and do something crazy, but explore using a new technology to see what you can create, what you can innovate on, and what you can do is make as a difference.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of follow up on that a little bit too. One of the disconnects I see, and I don't know if you see it, is that people have kind of a very limited understanding of AI, right? Like even within generative AI, they're really just kind of understanding it as a chatbot, right? And they're struggling. Well, how does this work with a student, right, to write a paper like using a chatbot and still learn how to write? But earlier you brought up the IoT, which for our listeners is the Internet of Things, or the idea that all different, you can connect anything now almost to the internet, even cows, right? And a lot of people are saying everything that exists, it will eventually think, right? Jensen Huang, right? The reasoning models. And I wonder if there's a way to kind of help, or two questions, right? Do you see kind of faculty being more kind of limited in how they're seeing AI, which maybe kind of limits its potential? And then how could we better communicate with faculty, not just in higher ed, but also at K-12, all the different uses. I just did a project with some high school students where we use like random forest decision models to test the local biome and do disease prediction, right? That's all additive. That's not like replacing their thinking. But I think, a lot of people wouldn't even think of something like that, which really is not even that complicated because they're just kind of seeing it as something they kind of type with and maybe eventually talk with.
Yeah, I'll share two. I'll share two ideas which are a little bit outside of the confines of a university or the academy, but I think they're relevant. There may be lessons that can be taken in. So one of the things I did at Internet 2 was we set up an AI lunch and learn, just a virtual Zoom meeting, and instead of me, the administration, although I probably did talk too much. I like to talk. But instead of it just being me talking about, hey, here's what you can do with AI. Here are the services we have. Like, that was a component about it. I brought in people on my team to showcase what they're doing. And it was not, management. It wasn't the director level. It wasn't the management level. It's, hey, how are you using something, like a project in Claude? I was thinking of a real example, right? How are you using something like a Claude project to go beyond just asking questions, right? You've brought in files, you're preparing things. How are you taking a manual process? We had this manual process where people had to go through a spreadsheet they get every month or quarterly, compare it to the previous spreadsheet. What's changed? What's not changed? Like, we built that in a Claude project. It's a great future agent activity, but starting point, we built that into a Claude project. We shared it out. Everyone can go use it. There's probably 10 people who needed to do that task. One person needed to do it. They teach it. We're using Claude Code right now to do a contact verification project, right? We all know there's been a lot of churn in higher ed since COVID. How do we make sure our contacts for various services, for various programs are still at the university? We have an intern using Claude Code to do that. I plan to have him present to the staff on doing that. So how do you sort of bring forward those bottom up activities? Here's a faculty member that's doing. How do you also create an environment where students feel comfortable sharing with their faculty members or others at the university what they're doing? And creating that, not just sort of like the traditional symposium, oh, you did some research, you created something, but more the knowledge transfer session of, hey, here's how I'm able to do this. And I think I'll share a real example that's a work example, but I think it's pertinent to academics in a way. I had someone on my team who sent me some AI slop. Sure, you've had that as faculty members, where it's just like very clearly, it's not even just it's very clearly AI slop. It's like, I know what model specifically wrote it, right? It was Gemini, right? The more you do this, you can get the personality. Where's the M dash? Okay, so it's probably this one. And my immediate reaction was to dismiss it out of hand as this is AI slop, just in how the document was structured, how it looked, some of the, if this then cadence of the document. But instead I asked the person like, hey, how did you create this? Right? There was an inordinate amount of work that went into the AI outcome that for me, immediately I dismissed it as, well, I could have went to Gemini or Claude or ChatGPT and generated this myself. Why do I have you do it? Well, I didn't know that person had, 6 pages of notes that they fed in and had done all this research and, put in more from voice one day about some of their thoughts. Like, I didn't know all the process that went into actually creating it. So I think opening up that discussion about even when you see something that looks like it was clearly AI generated, like, how did you get there? The output's really good. It's grounded in research. It's grounded in that person's expertise. It's grounded in their perspective. The output should have been at copy edited, right? But the actual work product is just fine. So how do you enable those experiences that maybe it's a little bit, maybe we took a different process, but actually the outcome still shows evidence of learning. It still shows evidence of exploration when you learn about how they got to the outcome and how do you open up and create a safe space for those conversations.
It's interesting because there's this sense of changing norms. and our expectations for what that work product is going to look like, how we're going to come across that work product. And it's so hit or miss right now that some people, if they find out it's AI, they're going to dismiss it out of hand. If some people saw the work and they're like, why didn't you use AI? There might be a little dismissive if you're not using it the way they think you should, but also how transparent that needs to be. That's certainly something for us to think a lot about. What I want to ask you a little bit about how we move forward in higher ed and any institution, what the bottleneck that you see, like what's the most common bottleneck that you find on campuses that are maybe the administrators are thinking about wanting to encourage AI use, maybe some faculty are even thinking about it, but things aren't quite happening the way one might expect them to happen. So is that bottleneck technical? They don't have the technical setup, the IT setup, cultural, that maybe there are a number of traditional academic perspectives that are maybe preventing them from being able to do this? Is it about internal politics? What do you think is holding back a lot of these institutions?
Yeah, what's the saying? Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yeah.
So I think it's always culture. I think all of those things feed into culture, but it's how do you create, just like any workforce in any industry, how do you create a healthy culture that can both debate, that can have dissent, but that can also move quickly. So when I look at, what are the bottlenecks? We talked a lot about, we being me and peers, IT leaders at other organizations, we talked a lot about in 2023 and in at least the early part of 2024, sort of the access problem of how are we making good performant tools and models available to students, faculty, and staff? How are we ensuring equity in that? I think when you look at the announcements, particularly out of Google and Microsoft, of making their services available to licensed students and faculty with data protection, that goes a long way to solving an equity problem, particularly as you see, the Gemini models sort of catch up or surpass some of the other models in benchmarking if the university's already paying for that. So I think a lot of it comes back to the enablement and the governance piece that we were just talking about. So, there was an EDUCAUSE study that came out, their IT landscape study, that was really interesting to me, where it said 94% of higher education professionals in the study reported using AI for work, but only 54% knew whether their institution had an AI policy or not. And that was striking to me, and sort of in the context of my answer to the previous question of, I feel like every institution spent so much time on, here's our AI policy. I know, working in the contract space, that, every institution is spending so much time on, well, I need to renegotiate the contract because of AI. I need to have an AI addendum because of AI. And all of that, I think in some cases is slowing down adoption. I think in some cases is creating fear of use in some users of, okay, well, if this is such a big deal that we needed to spend a year on governance, we needed to spend a year on policy, procurement takes a year, right? Like, it seems that there's something inherently risky and inherently scary in that technology. And there are things, I mean, we'll be honest, right? There are things that are risky in these technologies. There are impacts on things like intellectual property and the environment that we very much care about in higher education. But at the end of the day, I do think that some of that work and some of that time has created a bottleneck that we might have been better served at putting in the enablement basket. And that to me, that still becomes the bottleneck of sort of a very risk-driven culture around some of this, versus the academy being an innovation engine and sort of pushing the envelope. And that to me, I think is a bigger bottleneck in 2025 than access is. There's a lot of ways to get access. It's the enablement piece.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, that's what I was thinking, as you were talking. Intuitive to me, and I was first going to ask your opinion, but then you answered the question, and so I was like, it's probably easier to scale the technology than the adoption. Do you have any, you talked about some, examples, like, having people like work on projects they were doing, but do you have any ideas, like, to help like scale this, right? Like, you're gonna go to Mary Washington, right? And you're gonna be in residence, and part of that, I assume, right, will be kind of helping us scale in the university. But, work with these consortiums, right? And What are some things that maybe kind of are just a couple ideas or just practical things? Because it's a way people are going to have to maybe change the way they teach way more than maybe just adding another class, right? Changing the way they teach across all the classes. We might have to have different majors or permutations of majors. There's a lot to think about. So I'm just wondering if you could share a couple ideas for scaling.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the advantages we have in higher education is the fact that institutions are willing to work together. The fact that um, faculty members and researchers have peers at institutions across the country that they're working with, that they have strong relationships with. So I think leaning into not putting your university or your college or your research institution on an island is one of the most important things here. If you're spending a long time developing your AI policy as an institution, there are many institutions out there that have very strong AI policies that have spent a lot of time. There are some that have gone out and hired high dollar value consulting firms to help develop them. There are some that have gone out and done surveys and interviews and have put a lot of effort into it. I think one of the ways to scale some of this, and I'll talk about it on the technology side first. I kind of want to talk about it more on the policy or governance side first, since that's what I was maybe critiquing a little bit. Of course, to me as a technologist, the technology is the easy part, right? It's all the other stuff. But we'll get to the technology. I think leveraging what other universities or even corporations have created and focusing on what makes it unique for your institution, that's a great way to scale. So if you think about the shared experience that Anand and I have at Mary Washington, if you think about Mary Washington, does Mary Washington need to write its own AI policy? Does it need to create its own AI governance framework? Does it need to write its own AI contract addendum? Or should it really focus about what's unique about a public liberal arts and sciences institution as applied to a framework that is scaled across multiple institutions? And I think that's where you can get some speed. That's where you can get some velocity is, let's not relitigate some of these things. Let's focus on what's unique about our institution and the unique value proposition that we bring. And I think that's a healthy conversation to have in 2025 anyways, when you think about some of the attacks on higher education, when you think about, the enrollment cliff coming is really focusing on how are we unique, versus it. On the technology side, there's a similar dynamic that exists. There's been a lot of, I think many good rollouts of open source and commercial, multimodal AI systems. Like, one I like to point to is Vanderbilt has created Amplify AI, which is a solution that they built in collaboration with AWS, sort of open source multimodal system. You can set it up. They've done a lot of evangelism and support of other universities setting it up. So you have that starting point of, hey, there's other universities, there's peers at other universities. I can go ask how they set it up. There's videos out there. But then as I have questions, as I think about, well, now we want to integrate MCP, the model context protocol, into this. Has anyone done that? Right? I don't need to reinvent the wheel. So on the technology side, I think paying attention to what other universities have done and making sure you have those connections at those other universities to leverage that. There's great economies of scale to be achieved there that I think can help us all lift faster.
You're answering part of this question as I'm thinking about kind of timelines for change. One thing we've talked about, frequently in different interviews and updates that we've had is just the rate of changes is just something that we're not accustomed to, anybody in society. And certainly within the rest of society, we're trying to come to grips with it. For higher education, we would typically look at higher ed as the place for innovation. And now we're worried about higher ed keeping up. So when we're thinking about those changes, and you're outlining one strategy of collaboration, which I think makes a lot of sense. And that kind of fits into something we've been talking about. We need to teach students collaboration, right? This collaborative model is one that allows for greater input and better checks on what's happening while also streamlining it. I'm wondering if you're thinking about higher education in terms of adapting to some of these changes, right? It's one thing for us to set up and spend a lot of time developing policy, reviewing proposals, adopting a platform, and then the model changes.
And then it's out of date.
Yeah, it's out of date, or there are new features. and we just can't review them the way we would have past ed tech. I'm kind of wondering, when we think about this timeline, should higher ed, and from your perspective, just work on speeding up to be able to keep up? Or is there something to be said for keeping some of the deliberate consideration, the slightly slower timeline for higher ed for other academic purposes?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a unique higher ed component of this, but I think it's also a societal question. Like, you think about the United States Congress, and there's various things we could say about the United States Congress that are not relevant to this podcast. But you know, when you go back and look at, I was a political science major undergrad, as Anand knows, when you look at sort of the purpose of the founders, that was created to be slow and deliberate and not reactionary to to sort of shifting whims of society, as like a moderating force. And I do think there is, when you talk about the deliberative nature of, shared governance and sort of the natural curiosity that academics have to really understand things before leaping in with both feet. There's enormous value. I think there's enormous value in that in a society that we have that is moving faster and faster. So, going back to the premise of your question, I think it's absolutely a balancing act. One of the things I try to enable in my day job at Internet 2 is, how do we leverage different strengths, different capabilities, different resourcing availabilities at different universities to try to share that workload, so we can still go relatively deep, but also try to go fast. So I'll give you a practical example. And I'll give you an AI practical example. We are recently, well, not so recently now, we did what we call a service evaluation for a service called Portkey. Portkey is an AI gateway, so providing access to multiple models through sort of a single pane of glass, with governance, visibility, cost control, audit. That was something that universities really wanted. Obvious and self-evident reasons as we have this conversation. One of the things we did, we brought a group of 7 or so universities together. And if you're able to say, University A, please go do the accessibility review of this service. University B, please go do the security review of this service. University D, can you work on the legal and the contract piece? University E, can you work on the business model? And obviously, everyone needs to be part of those discussions. But if you can start to share that workload of, we know there's a technology we all want to adopt, how can we share strengths? There are some universities that have very, very strong, very large accessibility teams. There are some universities that have very strong, very large security teams that maybe have a very small accessibility team. Where do you invest based on past risk and past experience? And if we're able to leverage those as a collective, I think that can help us move fast while still going deep. And I think the same thing is true as you look at the evolution of some of these services in how do we do that? I'm the owner of Claude at Internet 2. And, last week, maybe it was earlier this week, it's like, oh, by the way, everyone now has access to Claude Code, right? Through the licensing. So it's like, all right, I had to react to that. And it's like, well, and it was like a Friday afternoon email. So it's like, I need to react to that like now over the weekend, because people are going to use this. What are they going to do? They were, co-work, I think we know, is now coming, for all accounts. There's a little bit more notice on that. So there's time to prepare. So for something like that, do I need for Internet 2, an organization that has about 150, 160 people, do I need to be coming up with the best practices of how to use co-work? Do I need to be providing guidance on how to avoid prompt injection risks?
Yeah.
Probably not. Someone's probably already done that. How do I sort of create a conversation across higher ed or across other organizations like Internet 2 to say, all right, someone have capacity to take this?
Yeah.
Has someone already done it? So that there's still that level of due diligence done, but not every university needs to go deep on everything if we're able to share it. And that, again, I think allows us to focus on, what's really unique and special about many of the colleges and universities here in the United States.
We talked a lot about maybe things that, kind of fit into governance, regulation, adoption. There's that term now that everyone likes to use. I think it was some article written by an MIT professor, right? The arrival technology. right? And a lot of this conversation is, how are we going to kind of make these technologies available on campus to faculty, right? How are they going to use them? How are we going to make sure they're using them appropriately, especially like when new features are released? But my guess at a lot of universities, I know high school students are already using Cowork. Right. So is there kind of or do we just need to admit that we're not going to be able to govern all this? I mean, legally, right? We're gonna have to kind of govern appropriately what the university decides to make available both to faculty and students, right? That's going to have to be governed. But is it really just a reality that there's going to just be kind of a lot of kind of ungoverned Wild West use, so to speak, on a campus? How should we think about that?
I mean, I think that's been true of any sort of foundational technology. And one of the things that I grappled with, I think from it was not sort of my chat GPT moment. It was not in the first month or two of using AI. It was probably later, is, just sort of given my own life experience and my own work experience, like, is this the internet? Is this the cell phone? Or is this like cloud computing? Because those all look slightly different to me on a continuum of how transformational and unique they are. And obviously there's people out there who think this is the internet, and there's people out there who think this is not. I'm not going to weigh into that debate. I'm not going to weigh into that debate here, but just as it relates to thinking about your question, thinking back to when I was a student, there were certainly you would receive you would review your syllabus, and it would say no cell phones are allowed in my class, right there, right there in bold, right? And I had this conversation with my high school principal when I was in college. I don't even like I had gone back to visit, and like we were having this conversation. And we had the question about like, hey, what do you think? Should we ban cell phones? And my answer then, as a 21-year-old, or 20, probably 20 or 21-year-old, is the same answer I'll give today with a lot of hindsight, which is not what's happening in high schools across the country. I think the trend's actually spinning the other way, which is no. And my reasoning for that, and my reasoning for this while I sit here, is every meeting I am in, I have my phone, I have my computer, which I have an enormous amount of distractions in front of me. I have to learn how to deal with those distractions, those technologies. I have to learn the appropriate use of those technologies, when it's appropriate and when it's not. And sure, I screw up like everybody else. But I think it's important, if we're thinking about how do we teach responsible citizens, take it more broadly than how do we teach people how to go out and get a job and work in society. If we're trying to teach responsible citizens need to know how to use this technology, and they probably also need to screw up and get called on it. So when I look at it, and maybe that's a fair question in high school of like, is a 16-year-old ready for that moment or not? I'm gonna try to exit out of that part of the discussion. But I think going back to it, like, you got to learn how to live with it. You're not telling students they can't use the internet. You're not telling students they can't use their cell phone. There are appropriate ways to use it. There are appropriate ways not to use it. And I think there's appropriate ways to challenge people to do things, while using it and without using it, just like the calculator. I love that. Here's one thing that 21-year-old me would not agree with. I love that blue books are making a comeback. I think that's awesome. I always forgot to bring them, when it was like Blue Book Day. So there's like an inherent stressor in that, but like it's like working out. It's like exercising a muscle. Your workflow using AI is very different than your workflow sitting down and writing. And I actually think, to teach sort of responsible consumers of information moving out, and producers of information and content, they got to be able to use both. That's where I come down on it. That's more my personal opinion than my professional opinion, as was probably clear by the tone of my answer. But that's where I come down on it, Stefan.
So I think the follow-up to that is, what do you think AI that actually fits academic work would look like in practice? If you could design it from the ground up, what would it look like, and how would that work?
Well, you're giving me an opportunity in a couple of weeks, right?
Right.
No. So in all In all seriousness, I mean, I think the using it as a tool of creation. I love the name. I hate that Microsoft calls everything Copilot now. Like sometimes when I go to like open a Word document on my phone, it's like, where's Word? Oh, it's Copilot now. But I love the name Copilot. So when I think about what would I design for a student, both trying to reflect on my own academic experience, but also thinking about, as an employer, as someone who's, responsible for growing and supporting a team of almost 20 people, what would I want someone coming out and entering the workforce to be able to do? It's understanding how to use it as a co-pilot. It's not a replacement. It's how does it help make you more productive? How does it help you interrogate your ideas? One of the great things I love to use AI for is to challenge me. It's not very good at it unless you ask it to. Some of the ChatGPT self-aggrandizement is also nice when you're having a bad day of like, wow, Shawn, that's such a brilliant idea. You really thought that through. And it's like, well, I didn't, but thanks. I feel better now. But how do you use it as a co-pilot? And how do we start thinking about how do we integrate in many of the different additional tool sets? So the idea of how do I use something like a Canvas feature, right? Where I'm working side by side, I'm editing the doc, I'm saying, all right, go out and find me some data to support this section. Or, I hate what I wrote in this paragraph. Here's what I'm trying to really say, but I have writer's block. Like, rewrite it for me. How do I incorporate voice into that work mode? How do I maybe incorporate add-ons through an MCP server to bring data in? But then thinking about how do I bring in images? When you look at something like Nano Banana or whatever it's called, um, how are there ways to enhance your output where you might not be strong, right? I think I'm on it, or Dr. Rao in this context, you'd be a better arbiter of this. I think I'm a pretty good writer when it comes to thinking about like, what are some good graphics to go in a report that I've written? What should, like, how would I design an infograph? Forget it. That's just not my strength. But if I put, if I'm working on a report right now, if I put it all into Notebook LM and hit infograph, it's like, aha, that's what I wanted. That's what I'm trying to convey. So like, that's the big thing for me in designing for the ground up is how do you get that broad set of exposure where none of it's really a replacement? It's additive, and it helps you be more creative. It helps you produce more content, and it may help you put your content into multiple different modalities or ways of thinking about things. I'll share something personal where I think this is super, super helpful. And I have some other like professional examples around this too. I think some of the ability that generative AI has brought us to make content more accessible to learners is really fantastic. So I'm dyslexic. I hate to read. I love going to lectures. I soak it up. I remember it. I know it's hard to believe I love going to lectures given my attendance record that I started this podcast with. But like sitting down and reading a book, like it's challenging for me. I love to listen to audiobooks. I started putting stuff into 11 Labs and listening to it. I've started putting things into 11 Labs or Notebook LM. And when I drive to go pick up my kids at daycare, I listen to it. It makes me more efficient. So both thinking about learning style and efficiency, how do we expose all these various different things where maybe if we have a learner who's really struggling, some of the tools in generative AI, whether it's, I just think Notebook LM is fantastic for this, whether it's a flashcard feature or a podcast feature, or how do we gamify things maybe to make learning more intriguing for a student? There's so many options there. Like that's where I would start is how do I use some of these tools to meet learners where they are? Because it's just a fantastic opportunity to do that.
Your class attendance record that you're talking about is probably similar to mine. And my guess is, nowadays, maybe kids go to class and they're distracted by their phone or all the stuff they have in their computer. You and I, we were just so distracted by other things that we didn't go at all, right? So
yeah, I was going to say if I had a smartphone that wasn't a BlackBerry Pearl, my senior year of college. I might have shown up more.
Yeah, I mean, I skipped class a lot to go do debate work, and I was like, if I just could have sat in class and done it on my laptop,
Right.
You probably would.
Yeah, no. And as Anand knows, I was student government president in college. I was working on a campaign. It wasn't that I wasn't
You were
learning.
plenty busy, that's for sure.
I was very high on the experiential learning side. Let's put it.
Yeah.
Before that was cool. I think I was doing experiential learning before it was cool.
Yeah,
Same with you,
it's
Stefan.
now it's a new thing though. We could have a whole other podcast about my thoughts on that.
Well, I know we're running out of time. Shawn, thank you so much for being so generous with your time for this really interesting discussion. For anybody listening and they want to find out more about your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, internet2.edu will get you there. Yeah, certainly, feel free to reach out there. You can find my contact information on the website or LinkedIn. I do try to post some interesting higher ed relevant content on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Well, perfect attendance today. We appreciate it. And I look forward to welcoming you to campus for your guest talk. Thanks again, Shawn. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thanks.